And it has been an incredible experience for us. This is a ministry that really that deals directly with people who are sick. Rochester, Minnesota is the home of the Mayo Clinic, and as a result of that, everybody who comes up, what we do is we house people who are coming to Mayo for different kinds of appointments, for surgeries, for all kinds of different things. And we minister to them while we're here. Just as a brief introduction to this thing, this is the physical houses of compassion. This one on the left here is, okay, that's not working. This one on the left here is the old house. That was original. It was bought by the Rochester Church of Christ in 1985 for the purposes of this ministry. The one on the right was put up in 2007. Just going to take you through a quick tour of the houses. This is a dining room area, and this is the main living room area in the old house. And this is on the left here, you got a television room, and on the right you have a bedroom. Well, one of the things that we do is intentionally is there are no televisions in any of the rooms. And the reason for that is we want people to congregate in the same places. Because a lot of times if you put a television in a room, all of a sudden it feels like a motel and nobody leaves their room. But one of the things we want is for people to talk to each other who are going through different things, because they in turn minister to one another as well. And it really becomes a great ministry tool to have people congregate together. This is inside the new house. This is built in 2007. And as you can see, it's a lot newer, a lot nicer kind of atmosphere. Although I prefer the old style of the old place myself. But each of these rooms has an indoor bathroom and all that kind of stuff. These are the people who work there. On the left, we have Chris and Cindy Frazier. And I got to tell you their story because their story is really incredibly cool. Chris and Cindy came to the House of Compassion 14 years ago with their daughter who suffered from MS and needed to go to the Mayo Clinic. And they went and they stayed in the old house that I just showed you a few minutes ago. They stayed in that old house, and they were met at the front door by Boots, who was the house parent at that point in time in her life. They got to talking in the living room about all the things that they were going through, the things with their daughter, and then it led into a mutual interest that Chris and Boots had in baking. And they started talking about apple pies and baking apple pies and recipes and all that kind of stuff. And later on that evening, it got to be too late, and they went to bed. And Chris and Cindy said the next morning they came down to go to their appointments, and Boots was there with an apple pie in hand that she had made at about midnight the night before, so that she could give to these people. And that just stuck with them. They were incredibly amazed by that experience. And so they were going home after going to the Mayo Clinic, and on their way home they said, man, when we retire, this is the kind of job this is what we need to do. If something like this ever opens up, we need to do this. Well, last December we put this thing in our newsletter that we send out to all the churches and all individuals who've come to the house. And in this newsletter, it said, we're looking for house parents for the same place that these guys had been in before. And they got this newsletter 2 days before Cindy was set to retire. And they looked at these things and they're like, how is this possible? I mean, it just felt like God was working to get them there. And I believe he was, because they've been an amazing benefit. But it is extremely neat to watch how God operates and moves things in ways that we don't expect it sometimes. Deborah, she has been a house parent for 8 years here in that newer house. And Deborah, she is so good with people. Some of her best friends are people who have stayed with her over the last 8 years. And when she goes on vacation, she goes to visit people who've stayed at this house because she's become so close to them. My job as the chaplain is hospital visitation and Bible studies and things of that nature. And so when people go to the hospital for surgery, I'm there with them. And that is an incredible part of my job, because I'm going to tell you some stories today of some people who had some amazing faith that I've met through this experience. This house began with this tiny little church here. We still meet in the same building. But this began back in the early 70s and 80s. This church had about 80 to 100 members back there from people. That information comes from people who were living and going to this church at that time. But it had about 80 to 100 members. And what was common in the Churches of Christ back in the 70s and 80s is if you were going to a hospital somewhere, you'd call the local church, and oftentimes somebody would be around and say, yeah, come stay at our house. It's a very much a hospitality-oriented mindset. Well, this small little church is sitting right in the heart of the biggest hospital system in the world. And so all of these people were getting these calls from these other places all over the country saying, could you give me a place to stay? And people were putting them in their basements, in their guest rooms, any place that anybody had room. There was almost consistently somebody there staying who was coming from Mayo. And so the origins of this place are incredibly cool because it starts out with people doing what's a Christian thing to do, and that's taking care of others because who are going through difficult things. Boots Young, she was from Canton, Ohio, and she was one of those who stayed at the home of Jerry and Gladys Willis, who were members of the congregation there. And in a casual conversation, they started talking back and forth and said, why don't you guys buy a house that people could stay in? And Jerry and Gladys, they thought that was an excellent idea. And so they basically wrote everybody who had ever stayed in an individual's house that they had records for, and they said, we are looking at this house for around $80,000. And we would like to, if possible, raise a 20% down payment so that we can purchase this house so that we can have a place to put people. And $60,000 out of the $80,000 came in from just those people who had come through. And it's just an incredible aspect of generosity. Boots went back to Canton, Ohio, where she worked for a while, but after this house was built, Jerry and Gladys called her back and said, hey, we would like you to come be the first house parent. And she was a widow at that time. She was kind of set in what she was doing in Canton and wasn't really all that excited about moving to Minnesota. But they said, just come see it. Come see what we got going here and then make a decision. And so they flew her up to Rochester and showed her the house, and she said she fell in love with it and ended up staying there for about 17 years as the house parent, I think until she retired in 92. She's still alive in Canton, Ohio, but has some medical issues of her own. One of the goals of this ministry is to help people bear the burdens of those seeking physical healing. And this can happen in a number of ways. We'll get into some of those later. We try and provide a spiritual haven for troubled hearts. One of the things, I was hoping Jeff would be here to hear this, but one of the things that really affected us is when we were going through surgeries with William. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Jeff Weaver and Beth Weston and Kimber McLean all showed up at our hospital. And they were there throughout that whole process for us. And that was an incredible thing to us. That meant the world to us. Because all of a sudden, we've got these people here who can help take distractions off of what's going on around us. And that's kind of one of the things we try and offer through this thing. A lot of people who come to the Mayo Clinic come alone. They don't have anybody else with them. They may have one family member, maybe two, but a lot of people who come, their family can't come because it's too far of a trip. And so what we help provide is companionship and people to be there for them with that. We look for opportunities to evangelize in non-threatening manners. Only 50% of the people who come through here are members of the Church of Christ. And so that provides some awesome opportunities for ministry. And we try and serve the physical needs of patients and their families by extending acts of kindness and services. One example of this is we had a guy stay with us one time who basically drove from South Dakota all the way to Rochester, Minnesota because his kidneys were shutting down. And he checked himself straight into the ER when he got there. He was all alone. And he called us. He'd been associated with the houses before, and so he called us to let us know what was going on. And so I went and visited with him. And after praying with him and talking with him for a while, I was getting ready to leave. And he said, "Can I ask one more thing of you?" I'm like, "Sure, what is it?" And he said, "Well, my luggage is in my car. I have no underwear." Because he checked himself in the emergency room and all of his stuff was in a vehicle. And so it was an incredibly cool opportunity to basically help this guy who has nobody else to go get his underwear for him in the car. And we get a lot of people like that who come up. One guy comes up from northern Minnesota. His name is Ron, and he is a wonderful man. He was actually baptized by the guy who had my position ahead of me, Stacy Sykes, while he was in the hospital thinking he was dying. And he managed to get through that. He went home. But one of the amazing aspects of what happened with him is he needed companionship. So we played cribbage together. Somebody here taught me cribbage. Oh yeah, my in-laws. Okay. But Galatians 6:2 and 9 and 10 says, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." I want to tell you a couple stories about some various people. James and Linda Busby, you see them on the left there, and also at the top with Therese and Hannah is Linda in a hospital bed. And James and Linda, they're actually at Mayo Clinic right now. But they are people who have become close friends to me. And a lot of it started in the way they began their time there. Last February, we found out from somebody else down in Arkansas that they were up at the hospital and went to go visit them. And Linda had basically been meta-flighted up from Arkansas to the Mayo Clinic for a liver transplant. And she was given one almost immediately, which very rarely happens. But as she was up there, we got to talking and praying a lot, and James came and stayed with us at the house and became very close to each other. And one day, all of us were at church. And I get this call from these two people down on the bottom on the right, Brian and Renee, saying Linda has gone into the hospital. She's at the ER. She fell off a bar stool. And so we're really scared about what's going on with this woman. And so I had to take my family home, and then we would rush back to the hospital. And by the time I got my family home into the hospital, I found Chris and Cindy there in the emergency room, Deborah in the emergency room. The president of HOC, who's a member of the board and goes to that church, he was there. Just all these people just showed up for these people because of what had happened. And to me, that was an incredible moment because all these people were just reaching out to this one couple. This has been extremely touching to them, and they will talk all about the hands of compassion. She still suffers from problems, and so we want to keep her in our prayers because she's up there till this day. Brian and Renee on the bottom here are a success story. They came last October. He had just been diagnosed with cancer. He had been baptized by a member of the church down in Oklahoma about 1 month before he came to Rochester. And so he was a very new Christian, Brian was. And they came up here, and we got to have a lot of discussions about God and various things that he wanted to know about. And over the course of 8 months, we don't often keep people there for 8 months, but over the course of 8 months, Brian ended up cancer-free. After chemo treatment and chemo treatment and chemo treatment, he was sick as a dog most of the time, couldn't leave his room a lot. But after a period of time, he is now cancer-free. We try and provide spiritual support. One of the ways we've done this is by having devotionals at the house all through the summer. And we'll do it again, I think, next summer because it was extremely successful, I think. But we would just gather, members of the church and members of HOC would come. And it was interesting because it also provided an opportunity for evangelism. A lot of the people we saw there who stayed for HOC were not members of the Church of Christ. But they participated in our devotionals, and it was really an incredible thing. The big things that we try and do for people, though, relate to surgery. And Charlie's story is one of my favorites. Charlie was a man who came last summer, and I first met him in the church. He had a bandage on his head, and I was talking to him, asking him, he's a visitor in the church, and so I was talking to him. They said, we're here for Mayo. And it's like, oh, and we're here for a brain surgery. Now, I had been at the House of Compassion all of 3 months when this happened. And so I gave him my card, said, if you need it, I'd love to sit and pray with you before your surgery. Give me a call if you need anything. Didn't hear from them again for 2 weeks. And then we're doing some evening activities, and all of a sudden, I get a phone call from Charlie's wife. And answer the phone, and she says, can you please come over here right now? We need you over here. And so I said, yeah, I can be over there in about an hour. And so I made it over there, went up to their motel room that they were staying in, and knocked on the door. And immediately, 3 women answered the door. And they said, oh, I'm so glad you're here. We'll leave you 2 alone. And they just ditched. They left. Nothing more than that. It was just, we're going to leave you alone. I've been at this job for 3 months. This is kind of a scary situation. I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. I don't know why they called me. I don't know anything. And so I walk in the door, and there's Charlie sitting on a chair. And I go up to him and start talking to him. And at first we're making some casual conversation. But as time went by, I began to discover something about Charlie and what was going on. This is a man who believed that the waiting room at St. Mary's Hospital, where he was about to have surgery, was his execution chamber. He earnestly believed he was going to die the next day. And he was scared. And we're sitting here talking and we're talking about some various things. And my mind went back to something that was done for me a long time ago. And that was to ask the question, well, how are you doing spiritually? How are you doing with God? These guys were members of the Church of Christ down in Arkansas, but a lot of times being in a church does not mean you feel like your conscience is clean toward God. And so I was concerned about him, and I asked him that question, how are you doing with your relationship with God? And he said, I'm doing good, I'm doing good. And we went on and we talked. The family came back, we prayed with them. I met with the family again the next day. We prayed with them before his surgery. And sitting in the waiting room, talking to his family, was an extraordinary experience because when I was talking to them, they said, I don't know what you said last night, but he completely changed. He went from talking about dying the next day to making a few jokes and laughing around with us. And they said, I don't know what you say. And I don't think I said anything. I think it was God working in this man. And the more I look back on that situation, the more I think that what he had and what he needed was he needed to have that hope that if no matter what happens, I'm going to be good tomorrow. And I think that changed his countenance with these people. And it was incredible to me to watch and listen to them talk about it. Because when I had talked to this guy the day before, I knew nothing about what had been going on this day, why they were worried, none of that. I think God was working in this man to give him that peace before he went through this. Charlie went on, had his surgery, and it went very well. And he went back home to Arkansas, and I haven't seen him since. But when you're going through something that big, and that room that you're in just feels like an execution chamber, that's a scary place to be. Cindy was a lady I heard about because we got a call from a friend of hers who heard she was in the hospital. And when I got this call, we were out getting some Dunkin' Donuts in the downtown area because we do that on a Saturday. That's our family tradition. And so we're out getting Dunkin' Donuts and we get this call saying this woman's in the hospital. So Therese and me and the kids go and visit Cindy. and and find out as we talked to them, so as I talked to them some more, found out that Cindy was a woman who came there because she had a punctured lung. She needed to have her spleen removed, and while she was there, she was also diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is a woman who had been through a lot. And I remember the next time I saw her, it was a Monday, I think, and we were sitting together and we were talking about all the things she had gone through and was going through, and I asked her the question, do you have people praying for you? It was interesting, her response. I don't remember it exactly, but it was that very, it was one of those responses where you feel like the person doesn't really have a Christian background, but they're trying to make themselves sound good in front of the minister who's in the hospital. And that's the vibe I was getting off this woman. And we got to talking a little bit, and one of the things I asked her, can I read the scriptures with you? And we would read the scriptures about Jesus. We read about the crucifixion. We read from Romans chapter 6, talking about baptism. We read it from Acts. We read from passages in John dealing with Christ's suffering. Because this was a woman who was suffering, and I felt she needed to hear some of those suffering passages. And as we were going through and we were talking, as I was reading this, she'd close her eyes. And at first I thought she was falling asleep on me. And so I asked her, do you want me to keep going or do I need to leave you? And she says, no, keep going. I'm listening. I just need to close my eyes. I'm like, okay. And we would talk and we'd read and all those kinds of things. She was there for about 3 weeks. And when she left, she said, part of me wonder. We talked about baptism the day she left, and she said, part of me wonders if I wasn't brought here because of this. And my hope is still that, those seeds are planted that can grow into something bigger. We try and serve people's needs. As you can see in the top left corner, William is really good at that. He's jumping on a kid named Jacob. And on the right and the bottom there, you see William and Hannah. They're cleaning house. And I have kids, so I got to show them off, so they're in the slides. And but I kind of want to tell you a little bit about this guy on the left here. His name is Stan. And the first 3 weeks that we were in Rochester, we didn't have... Our house wasn't going to close in time, so we had about 3 weeks that we had to find other places to stay. The first week we were there, we stayed in a motel, and that bill cost us about $700. And so Deborah, the lady in the other house, said, hey, we've got a room available. We can put you guys in it for the next 2 weeks. And so I'm like, okay. So we ended up staying in the House of Compassion here ourselves for about 2 weeks. And the first week we were there, Stan was there. And Stan, just while his wife and mother-in-law were going to appointments, Stan would just hang out at the house here with our kids. And he kind of became a third grandpa to them. I mean, he was just super special to them. He'd do all kinds of things with them. And they had a great week. And then Friday came around, and they had to go. And as we were watching their car drive away, I went back and found my daughter crying in our bedroom. And I went up to Hannah. I said, what's going on, Hannah? And she said, I do not like this place, Dad. And that just broke my heart because we had just moved here. We're stuck. And I'm like, well, what's going on, Hannah? Why don't you like this place? And she said, because I get to liking people and then they leave. And that is such a true statement in this place. It is incredible. When people are suffering, you develop relationships so much quicker. It's incredible. Several of the people who have come to stay at this house have met somebody else who's a guest there, and they may live 6 hours apart, but they will drive and meet each other in the middle because they want to see each other again. Because friendships get developed. A lot of times it's hard for these people to come together again, but they get developed, and many of these people try and come together. One of the things that I think is the most special thing about this ministry is that people minister to each other. And they do that. I told you at the beginning that there's no televisions in rooms. And the reason there's no televisions is because we want people talking together, and they often congregate in the TV rooms, and they'll be talking to each other about what's going on. One of my favorite stories was from a guy named Andy Smithy. He is just an amazing man, and I love seeing this guy. But Andy was a guy who, before we ever came, was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in his, I think his colon and his liver, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but he had it in 2 different organs. And he was basically told by the doctors at Mayo, your chances of survival are very, very low. You may have 3, maybe 5 years at the most. Well, this is a guy who's young. He's probably in his early 40s. He's got teenage kids at home. And all of a sudden, he is given this news that is devastating for him. When we first met him, it was the weekend that we interviewed up in Rochester. He was staying in the house there. He had just had a major colon surgery. He was later to go on and have a surgery on his lungs that he said just burned like fire for an entire month. But by June of last year, Andy was just given the diagnosis, you're cancer-free. We're going to keep giving you some chemo treatments, but right now you're cancer-free. We just want to make sure it doesn't come back. And it was really an incredible thing. Andy was super excited, and he had just gotten this news. Well, at the same time, there was a woman named Brenda there. And Brenda got about the worst possible news a person can get. We cannot help you. Mayo Clinic told her her illness was psychosomatic, and there was nothing they could do about it. She would feel like this sensation of her esophagus closing up, and it was super scary to her, but they said there's nothing we can do about it. And so she is back at the house, and she's bawling. She is devastated by this news. She wanted to hear anything but that. And Deborah and myself were trying to help her and calm her and all this kind of stuff when Andy Smithy stood up. And he said, Brenda, I want you to know something. He said, when I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and I was told I don't have long to live, he said, my life was devastated. I was ruined. I was imagining all these things about my kids growing up without me and all of these things going through my head. And he said, but I'd go home, and one of the things he said he liked to do was to build fences. And he'd go out every day for about an hour, and he would build fences. And during that time, he would pray to God. He would be with himself. And during that moment, he said, in my mind, I was cancer-free. I just allowed myself to be who I was and allowed God to take care of it. And it was incredible because with all the people trying to calm Brenda down, Andy, a survivor of stage 4 cancer, because of what he had been through, had more power to do that than anybody else who was there. And it was one of the most incredible stories I've ever witnessed. In Acts chapter 2, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. One of the reasons I have this passage up here is because this, to me, is one of this passage of scripture here is emulated very well in this ministry, I think. We are a church of about 80 people right now. And so this is a ministry that cannot be funded by the local church. The church is too small. And it's largely funded by people all over the country, people who have been there, people who have gone, churches who have had people go there. It all comes from everybody around us. I want to tell you about Christina. One of the things about Rochester, Minnesota is because of the fact that every single week there is a completely different group of people, all of guests in town, all for the Mayo Clinic, the hotels are pretty insanely priced. If you were to get temporary furnished housing in Rochester for about a month, you'd be looking at about $3,000. The average cost of a hotel in Rochester is anywhere in the vicinity of $80 to $150. And if you're looking at the $80 variety, they're the kind of places you don't really want to frequent. The average stay for a person at the Mayo Clinic is about 6 days. Christina was one of those people. Christina's story is really amazing too. She is a mother of 13 kids. 6 of them are her own. 7 of them are adopted special needs that nobody else wanted. Most of her kids are now grown up, but most of her adopted special needs kids are still in the house. And Christina, she had some appointments at the Mayo Clinic on Mother's Day. She had been there for a week on Mother's Day already, and she was without her family on Mother's Day. No kids, no husband, because the husband had to be back at home with the 6 kids still at home. And so she was all alone. She stayed in a motel. She was getting ready to have a biopsy on Monday morning and on her lung that she knew was going to be painful, and there was nobody with her. And she was staying at one of the hotels. I think it was the Holiday Inn. And she looked in the phone book and found our church and started driving up and down 2nd Street looking for it. Well, the church is small, and she missed it several times driving back and forth. And so the way she described it to me, she said, I said a little prayer to God saying, God, either help me find a place or I'm going back to the motel. And within a minute, she was driving by the church and found it, and she parked her car and she went inside. The first person she met when she was there was Chris Frazier. And he is the house parent of the old house over there. And he went up and she told her story that she's there for the Mayo Clinic. And he said, well, have you heard about the House of Compassion? And she said, no. And they got to talking about it, and there was a room available. And so we were able to take her in. And Chris and I were both talking to her about it. As soon as she was done with church, she left to check out as soon as class was over with, she left to go back to the hotel to check out before 11 o'clock, and she got another bill. And the price for her to be there for 7 days plus parking was $1,300. And this is a lot of money for her. She's got 6 kids at home. And so the next day, that day she came and she stayed with us. The next day she had 2 people, me and Chris, go and be with her before she got her biopsy done, before she was thinking she was going to be alone. And that was an incredible thing to me. She couldn't afford very much, and Rochester is way too expensive for most people who go there. Within the next 20 years, Mayo Clinic is looking to expand by about 38,000 employees. I'm sorry, about 25 to 30,000 employees. Currently, there's about 38,000 employees, which means they're about to double in size, and they're already one of the world's largest hospitals. This is one of the biggest medical expansion projects in the country, and it's happening right there in Minnesota. Over the course of the last year, we've had 2,923 people stay with us at the House of Compassion. Only about half of those, as I stated earlier, are members of the Church of Christ. And right now we have about 11 different rooms that are available for people. The cost for those rooms is about $42 a night for us, but nothing for the guests who stay there. It takes about $8,200 a month to operate. But anybody who comes, if they donate, great, but they're never asked to. Anybody who comes to the House of Compassion Ministry comes for free. And we have a lot of people who utilize the free aspect of that, because when you're dealing with medical costs already, sometimes you don't have the extra money. The Rochester Church of Christ, as I said earlier, is a very small congregation of about 100 members. We are too small to be supported by ourselves. There's just not enough people in the Rochester congregation to do that. And so the vast majority of our support comes from all over the country. It's funded by individuals and different congregations everywhere. one of the things that we are looking to do right now is we're looking to build on and build a third house. This past summer, we have been swamped with people every single week. And we have been so full, we've actually had to refer people to hotels. And we really don't want to do that. We want to be able to take people in. We have no elevator system. And that is a huge problem because we've only got 2 rooms that can be accessed for people who cannot navigate stairs. And so because of that, we also turn away a lot of people because there's no room for them. One of the things we'd like to do with the third house is we would like to make room for long-term guests. We have a lot of limitations on rooms. We only have 11. And because of that, we usually have to limit people to 1 to 2 weeks. And sometimes people need a lot longer than that. And we'd like to be able to provide that. More rooms would mean more opportunities to allow people to stay who need medical care. To build this third house, we're looking at about probably somewhere in the vicinity of $500,000 more dollars. We've got about $400,000, but about $350,000 is what we need. We've got about $400,000, but we're estimating based on prices from the last house that it'd be close to $750,000. And in order to fund that, we'd also need an additional about $10,000 in monthly contributions. This is a lot to ask, and it's something we're asking because we want to keep helping people. It is awesome to be in a ministry where we are dealing with people going through some of the worst times in their life. That is one of the things I love about this ministry. I'm going to be telling some stories about some other people in my sermon, some people who just have created in me a sense of awe at their faith in dealing with difficult situations. Within the past 2 months, I've had 2 people hear the news that you're not going to live much longer. And I've watched 2 people, I haven't watched 2 people die, but have been in the room with 2 people the day they died. In our church, we lost another guy due to medical issues yesterday who had come to Rochester for the Mayo Clinic and was there, and we just found this out yesterday. And so there's a lot of things that go on in Rochester, Minnesota that are very difficult for people. And it is so rewarding to be there and to listen to people's stories and see their faith as they're given bad news and to see how they deal with things. I think God makes people stronger at the end of their life. I really do. And I've seen that happen. I've seen people's face increase tenfold when they're given that news. And it is incredible to me to watch that. It's incredible for me to be there for that. And I appreciate you guys listening to my presentation about what we're doing. Ironically enough, the guy who asked me to be here isn't even here. So, so if you didn't like it, sorry. But I really appreciate this congregation. You guys are family and always will be to us. And we absolutely love this place. And let's go ahead and end with a prayer. And then the kids should be coming up in a minute. Dear God, I just thank you so much for being there, for loving us, for taking care of us. I just thank you for what you do for us, Father. God, you give so much. And I just pray that you give us that kind of faith that we need, that desire to move mountains. Help us to be the kind of people that we need to be in order to serve you better, Father. And I just God, thank you for the loving hearts of the people in this church, and I thank you for that. God, I just ask that you be with this ministry, and I also ask that you be with this church and bless it as well, Father, and keep it growing. God, I just thank you for the many things you've done for us. In Jesus' name, amen. On that back table, if anybody is interested, I've got some brochures. and some newsletters about the House of Compassion, if you'd like to pick those up.